Thank you, Kama. It's kind of funny. We're a little tight right in here, so I'm going to kind of get myself in here. Okay. Hi, everybody. So glad you could join us. Very excited you're here. I'm happy to be back again teaching numbers this week. Very exciting. I know you're just like, wow, I can't wait to hear about numbers. But first, we're going to do a little review like we usually do. And we're going to go back to the beginning. And every week it'll be different, I suppose. But, you know, we go back to Genesis, in the beginning, the book of beginnings. And we have the beginning of the universe, the beginning of the whole earth and everything in it. We have the beginning of man, the beginning of sin, the beginning of flood, and the beginning of nations. And that was at the Tower of Babel. And we also have the beginning of God's chosen people. And that was through Abraham. And he made a covenant promise with Abraham, if you remember. He promised him to make him a great nation, to bless him and make his name great. He promised to bless all the nation, all the earth would be blessed through him. And we know that that means through Jesus. That's a promise of the Messiah. And he promised him land. And this is an everlasting covenant. And it was passed on to his son Isaac, who was passed on to his son Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons, and those became the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph was one of his sons, and an amazing story. If you haven't read it, go back and read it. Go back and read it again and read it often because it's a wonderful story how he was sold into slavery. But in Genesis 50:20, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. So Joseph becomes second in command. There's a great famine in the land, and it affects Jacob and his family in Canaan. So they go to Egypt, and Joseph, they're reunited, and he's going to take care of them. Jacob brings his family of 70, and there they grow into a great nation. In the book of Exodus, which is the book of redemption, deliverance, and worship, there's a new Pharaoh now. It's been many years, and he does not know Joseph. And he's like, who are all these people? They're getting too great in number. We need to enslave them. So he does. They become their slaves for over 400 years. And during this time, Moses is born, and he becomes, he flees for his life because he kills an Egyptian, because the Egyptian was harming a fellow Hebrew. So he flees for his life. He becomes a shepherd for 40 years. And he meets God at a burning bush when God tells him, I need you to go back to Egypt and free my people. Tell the Pharaoh to let my people go. Of course, he doesn't want to, but he eventually obeys. And we had the 10 plagues. And the last plague was the death of the firstborn. And we know that the Hebrews were not affected if they followed God's law, which was to kill the lamb, put the blood over the doorpost, and the angel of death that night would pass over their home so no one would die. But in the Egyptian households, the firstborn died of the people and the animals. So the people left, they plundered the Egyptians, and the people couldn't wait to get them out and gave them all kinds of things, whatever they asked for. And they had become a great nation. They were over 2.5 million people. So they go through the Red Sea, and they're at Mount Sinai, and they spent a year there. They received instruction on the law. So they learned the moral law, which is the 10 Commandments, the civil law, which is like the Constitution for the Israelites, and the ceremonial law, which is their festivals, feasts, etc., and the building of the tabernacle, which was very specific instructions and pointed us to Jesus Christ in each of those. Lynn told us last week the earthly tabernacle was the Israelites' realization of the presence and glory of God. It was their way to approach God. The tabernacle was right in their midst. Today, Jesus Christ is our realization of the presence and glory of God, and he is our way to approach God. And our bodies today is the tabernacle of God. He dwells within us. She said that the second fall of man, as some people call it, is when Moses is up on the mountain. He's there for too long and the people are grumbling like, where's he gone? He's left us. Let's make a golden calf so we can worship it. God gets very angry and wants to wipe them out. But Moses intercedes and God changes his mind. And we learned that God just doesn't change his mind and his plans. He's not wishy-washy. We learned that his purpose is unchanging, but his plans are unfolding. So our prayers do matter and our prayers can count. He won't change his purpose, but he might change how he goes about implementing it. Then we went into the book of Leviticus, the book of holiness. They're still at the foot of Mount Sinai. He teaches the people how to live holy lives and how to approach a holy God. Leviticus 20:26 says, "You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the peoples to be mine." God's holiness is pure and powerful, but it's both good and dangerous. They had to learn how corrupt people can live close to his holiness without being destroyed. So they had rules. There were 3 solutions that they had. 1 was through rituals, 2 was through the priesthood, and 3 was through purity laws. They had the Day of Atonement once a year, that the high priest went into the Holy of Holies. And the blood of animals was the substitute for people's sin. God loves his people and he gives a clear way for them to know that they are forgiven and safe to live near his presence. So now we step into Numbers. My friend Nina's on here and we were college roommates. And I remember as a freshman going into my dorm room and with Nina there. And I remember a lot of the girls in our dorm went wild. I mean, they had newfound freedom and they were out late every night and they just couldn't handle this freedom that they never had. So they needed to learn how to say no. They needed to, because we go to class, don't go to class. Do your homework, don't do your homework. Do your laundry, don't do your laundry. Nobody checks, right? You have to learn. So we needed to learn to say no and go to class, and needed to learn our lessons and to be responsible. And that's part of the college experience. Now, reaching maturity can be painful and there are consequences to our actions. The people, the Israelites, had the same problem. They are now free. They've been slaves for over 400 years and they had this freedom and they didn't know how to do it. And they had these responsibilities that, and decisions they never had to make before because they were all made for them before. So now there were consequences to their actions. And they had resentment towards the Pharaoh, which, who had authority over them. And now they kind of transfer that to Moses, which is in turn is ultimately transferred to God. Now, the main story of Numbers is the movement of the Israelites from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. It should have just taken a few weeks, relatively quick trip. But unfortunately, it took over 40 years. Now, this book has been referred to in other parts of the Bible by poets. It's in the book of Psalms, and by prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah refer to the book of Numbers, and also the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, also refers to the book of Numbers. And it's called the book of Numbers because of the census. There's 2 censuses taken, one in the first chapter, the second one in the 26th chapter, and they number the people, hence the name Numbered. You could have called it the book of wanderings because, they wander for 40 years, or you could have called it the book of murmuring because I think they murmured or complained for 40 years. And Hebrews have 2 names for it. The Jews today call it in the desert because their unbelief brought about their desert. And also they call it and the Lord said, because that phrase and the Lord said is in there 150 times. And no, I didn't count it, but I take whoever the commentary wrote that I take their word for it. All right, the theme is wondering because of unbelief. And who wrote it was Moses. He even says in Numbers chapter 32, verse 2, he says, at the Lord's direction, Moses kept a written record of their progress. So he was told to write it down and keep a record. It was written to the Israelites, but it's also written to us because we can study it and see and learn more about them, but especially about God. When was it written? Between 1450 and 1410 BC. And why was it written? It's a story of Israel's journey to the promised land. We also learn about their disobedience and their wanderings and their second try. So here's a little chart kind of the book. The first 10 chapters deal with, they are in the wilderness of Sinai. So right at the base of Mount Sinai is the wilderness of Sinai, and that's where the people are. It's the old generation, which is the generation that was just came out of Egypt. And God has prepared them for entering the land. At the end of Exodus, in Leviticus, in the beginning of Numbers, God has prepared them. And it should, there were, that just took a few weeks. Then the second part of Numbers is chapters 10 through 21. And unfortunately, they wandered instead of going right into the promised land. Still the same generation, God prevented Israel from entering the land. And that was about 38 years. And then chapters 22 to 36, you'll see on there, they are now at the, right up to the promised land on the plains of Moab. They're just east of the Jordan River, and right across the river is Jericho. It is the new generation. It is the old generation's children. And God now has prepared them, the new generation, to enter the promised land. And that took a few months. Okay. And here's a map of Mount Sinai. You can see up in the upper left-hand corner, you've seen this map before, they left Ramses in Egypt, and they came down and crossed the Red Sea there up in the upper left-hand corner, came down to Mount Sinai. They're there at the wilderness of Sinai, and they're going to go up north and follow along, I don't know what, the Gulf of Agaba, and they're going, then they unfortunately are going to wander, and then they make it up to the upper right-hand corner where it says Moab, and they get up there to the plains of Moab. So right now they've been there at Mount Sinai for a year. God is ready to take them to the promised land. They have everything they need. They are a well-organized nation. They have a capable leader in Moses. They've got laws to govern them. They've got priests now to help them lead them in worship. And God himself dwells among them in the tabernacle. And he leads them where to go because they don't have a path. They don't know where they're going. So they just follow where God leads them. So Numbers begins and ends with a census and the numbering of the people in chapters 1 and 26. So if you have your Bibles, open it to Numbers. Chapter 1, we'll read verses 2 and 3. A year after Israel's departure from Egypt, the Lord spoke to Moses in the tabernacle in the wilderness of Sinai. On the first day of the second month of that year, he said, from the whole community of Israel, record the names of all the warriors by their clans and families. List all the men 20 years old and older who were capable of going to war. You and Aaron must register the troops, and you will be assisted by one family leader from each tribe. So they had to count all the men who were eligible to fight because they're going into the promised land and they're going to have war. They're going to have to fight. So they need the men that are old enough, 20 years old or older. They don't include those that are too old or too young or disabled. They don't include women, and they don't include the children. So they need to know how many warriors they have. And by the way, they numbered all the Israelites. We are numbered as well. You'll know in 2 Timothy 2:19 that the Lord knows by name all who are his. And even the very hairs on your head are numbered, according to Luke 12:7. And in Malachi, it says, a scroll of remembrance was written in his presence concerning those who feared the Lord and honored his name. So your name is on a scroll. And in Malachi, that's Malachi 3:16. So God knows and cares for each of us. And that is just super cool and super comforting for me. So the total in verse 46 says that there was 603,550 men 20 years and older that could go to war. So if you jump down to verse 47, the last verse tells us that the Levites were not included. The Levites are one of the tribes, one of Jacob's sons, and they were in charge of the tabernacle and the furnishings. They were to take it down, move it, set it back up. Every time that they moved, the tabernacle moved with them. They were to guard it and camp around the tabernacle to protect the people from the Lord's anger. Why, you ask? Why would he protect it from the people? Well, a holy God lives in that tabernacle, and the tabernacle itself is holy, and God is holy, and you could die if you go or touch or even look at things that you were not supposed to be. So, wait a minute, I think I put my paper down too soon. Yes, so let's look at how the camp was to be set up. Flip over to Numbers chapter 2, verse 1. Then the Lord gave these instructions to Moses and Aaron. When the Israelites set up camp, each tribe will be assigned its own area. The tribal divisions will camp beneath their family banners on all sides of the tabernacle, but at some distance from it. So if you'll see in the chart here, we have the tabernacle in the middle, which is where God dwells. And we have around that is what God said that the Levites were to camp around the tabernacle. So those 4 squares that you see around the tabernacle are the Levites. We have Moses and the priests to the right, which is to the east. We have the Kohath to the south, and the Kohath are in charge of the sacred items in the tabernacle. The Gershon are to the left or to the west, and they are in charge of the curtains, the coverings, and that sort of thing, the ropes and other things of the tabernacle. And the Merari are on the north side, and they're in charge of the frames and the crossbars and the posts and the bases. And they were to set them up, carry them, move them, and set them back up again. So on the east side, where Moses and the priests are, is Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. And Judah is the head of that group over there. Judah, if you remember from Genesis, is the head of the most blessed, and that is the tribe that which Jesus will come from. The south side is the Reuben tribe, and with him is Simeon and Gad. And on the west side is the Ephraim tribe with Manasseh and Benjamin. And then north is Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. And this is one arrangement, and this is another arrangement that some scholars believe that's what it looked like, because it says that it was Judah and then Issachar and then Zebulun. So it made it sound like they go out from each other and not next to each other. So if they went out from each other, then look at that. We have a cross, which I think is amazing, because so many of our things today or back then were, foreshadowing of Christ. So if you look at the numbers, the tribe of Judah and the other two, Issachar and Zebulun, at the bottom there were 187,000. So they had the most, and at the top, they had the least at 108,000. And to the right is the tribe of Dan, both the right and the left were about equal at about 151 and 157. So it would have looked like a cross looking down at it. Another different view would be this one here. If you've got the tabernacle, what a sight that would have been to see the smoke or the fire coming out from the tabernacle and having all those people, 2.5 million people. That would be intimidating. But that's just an awesome sight. And for us on this side of the cross, they had no idea what a cross was. They didn't know what they looked like, but we do. We have the ability to look and be in awe of God, to think of every detail. Okay, let's go to the next chapter, chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Then the Lord said to Moses, call forward the tribe of Levi and present them to Aaron, the priest, to serve as his assistants. So Aaron's and his sons and his descendants would be the priests, and all the other Levites would be assistants to the priests. And they would carry out the duties of the priesthood. They would serve on behalf of the Israelites, and they had sacred duties around the temple, and they would maintain the tabernacle and all of its furnishings. And in Numbers 3, if you jump down to 11, and the Lord said to Moses, look, I have chosen the Levites from among the Israelites to serve as substitutes for all the firstborn sons of the people of Israel. The Levites belong to me, for all the firstborn males are mine. On the day I struck down the firstborn sons of the Egyptians, I set apart for myself all the firstborn in Israel, both of animals and of people. They are mine, I am the Lord. So they are the substitutes. During the 10th plague, like we just said in Egypt, when all the firstborn sons were killed and their livestock were struck down, God is saying that the Levites are substitutes for that. So let's jump down to verse 45, still in chapter 3. Take the Levites as substitutes for the firstborn sons of the people of Israel, and take the livestock of the Levites as substitutes for the firstborn livestock of the people of Israel. The Levites belong to me, I am the Lord. So according to Exodus 13, in verse 12 to 14, when the Israelites' household in Egypt was passed over, the firstborn son was spared. So God's claiming them as his own. The Israelites had to buy them back. They had to redeem them. So this is how they redeem them. God's redeeming them by taking the Levites as his own, and they now belong to him. Instead of giving them the firstborn, they give them the Levites. And that's how it worked out there. The firstborn of the livestock is also God's, and that is sacrificed. So now the Levites are the substitutes for those who were spared in Egypt. Do we get that? So it was important to take a census of the Levites. So we knew how many there were, and they would take a registration of them 1 month or older. And this year it happened to be 22,000. So if the firstborn sons of Israel was more than the number of Levites, because they were supposed to be equal, God had a system to balance it out. So they had to collect pieces of silver for each person and give it to Aaron and sons as a redemption price. He thought of every detail. As I'm sure you've heard, God is a God of order. God is a God of detail. So anyway, there you go. If you were able to follow along with that, I thought that's pretty cool. Chapter 5 dealt with purity. This is important to God since God lived in the camp with the people. He was concerned about their purity. So he gave them laws and rituals and rules to keep them pure since they were dwelling with him. And today, because he lives in us and the tabernacle, our body is the tabernacle, he's concerned with our purity as well because he dwells with us. In chapter 6, if you jump over to chapter 6, Verse 22 is the priest blessing. I'm going to read that. Then the Lord said to Moses, take Aaron and his sons to bless the people of Israel with this special blessing. May the Lord bless you and protect you. May the Lord smile on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord show you his favor and give you his peace. Whenever Aaron and his sons bless the people of Israel in my name, I myself will bless them. So some of you may know that blessing, be familiar to you. It's a wonderful blessing to bestow on those we love and on others. Chapter 7 dealt with Moses setting up the tabernacle, and he anointed it and he set it apart as holy. So the leaders from each tribe each brought a gift for the dedication to bring to the altar. We won't go into all those details. If you're reading the full scripture, you will read about that. God spoke to Moses from between the cherubim, which are on the mercy seat. And the mercy seat sits on top of the Ark of the Covenant. And we know the Ark of the Covenant is in the Holy of Holies. So this is where Moses spoke to God. God dwelled with the people in the tabernacle. And we know that it was a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And when the cloud lifted from the tabernacle and it started to move, the people moved and followed it. Or if it was at night, it was a pillar of fire by night. And when it stopped, they stopped and they set up camp. Chapter 9 dealt with the Passover. It was, the first one was in Egypt. So this would be, was the actual blood and the actual time. And this would be the first time celebrating at twilight there in the wilderness of Sinai. Chapter 10, the Lord told Moses to make 2 hammered silver trumpets. And these were used for communication. Only the priests were allowed to blow them. And they were used to break up camp or to summon the people. It was 2 trumpet blasts. If you hear that, then all the people had to come and gather at the entrance of the tabernacle. Or if it was just 1 blast, then it was just the leaders had to gather. It could be an alarm. There was a certain system for alarm when they were attacked. It could be gladness of festivals, fun, exciting things, beginning of each month. It was also used for burnt and peace offerings. So they've been a year at Mount Sinai and it's time to go. So God's cloud moves and he leads them to Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran. So there is a travel order. They don't just, okay, everybody, and they all herd in one direction and follow it. No, there's order with God. So if you see here, there is a marching order, and starting at the bottom, see the arrows going kind of pointing down. All right, so the Ark of the Covenant is in the front with Moses and the priests. And then we have Judah, as we know, is the head of all, and Issachar, and then Zebulun. So they're all together. And then we have a break of the Levites, the Gershonites carrying the curtains and the coverings of the tabernacle. And then the Merarites carrying all the poles and the bases and the crossbars. They go next. Then we have Reuben, Simeon, Gad, and then we have more Levites, the Kohathites, and they're the ones carrying the sacred objects. Of course, they couldn't touch any of them. There was all used poles to carry them. And what I thought what was cool about that is that, God is, again, the God of details, is that by the time the Kohathites got there, the tabernacle was already set up. So they could just go right in and put the sacred objects where they belong. And next, the rest of the tribes, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin, and then Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. That's nothing you have to memorize. I just thought it was kind of cool that God has a perfect order and that the tabernacle would be ready for the sacred item. Anyway, the people believed and obeyed God in the first 10 chapters, And when they believed and obeyed, they had rest. Belief brings rest. All is good. But then you turn the page to chapter 11. And unfortunately, the complaining starts. God sends fire to discipline, and some had died. Moses intercedes, as he always does, for relief. And Moses was burdened with these people who were always griping, always complaining about food, about water, about leadership. So God said, get 70 men who were recognized as elders and leaders, and they will help carry the burden, so he doesn't have to carry it alone. And unfortunately, in chapter 12, even Miriam and Aaron complained. And they said, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he spoken through us too? Well, God heard it, did not make him happy. And he trusts Moses, and he speaks to Moses face to face. Why aren't they afraid to criticize his servant Moses? He asks them. Sure, they were tongue-tied and didn't know what to say. But unfortunately, Miriam was struck with leprosy and she had to leave the camp. But the one good thing is that it was just temporary, and she could come back in when she was pure again. Chapter 13 is a big chapter. Let's jump over there. I'm going to read chapter 1. The Lord now said to Moses, send out men to spy out the land of Canaan, the land I am giving to the Israelites. Send one leader from each of the 12 ancestral tribes. So they're in Kadesh Barnea, and they're going to send 12 spies into the land, into the promised land. And they're about to go to battle. There are people living there that are not going to willingly give up their land. So they're going to have to know what they're up against. One from each tribe. Caleb is one of the 12. He's from the tribe of Judah, and Joshua is from the tribe of Ephraim. And if you jump down to verse 17, it says, Moses gave the men these instructions as he sent them out to explore the land. Go through the Negev into the hill country. See what the land is like and find out whether the people living there are strong or weak, few or many. See what kind of land they live in. Is it good or bad? Do they have towns with walls? Are they unprotected like open camps? Is the soil fertile or is it poor? Are there many trees? Do your best to bring back a sample of what grows there. So here's a little map of their, they were gone for 40 days. And at the bottom left is Kadesh Barnea. And the red line goes all the way up to the north, and it ends at Labo Hamath. And then they came down the green line and came back. So 40 days they're gone, and they are ready to give their report. And all 12, because remember there's one from each tribe, said that the land is bountiful, it's wonderful, it's flowing with milk and honey. And they brought back a huge, luscious bundle of grapes. And it took 2 men to carry it, it was so heavy. But 10 of the spies said the people are powerful and huge. They're like giants. You know, they're so much stronger than us. We cannot take them. Their towns are large and they're fortified. How are we going to get into these towns? We can't do it. But Caleb and Joshua were the only two that said, let's go at once to take the land. We can certainly conquer it. Now, who do you think the people sided with? Let's turn to chapter 14 and find out. In verse 1, sorry, let me get my, okay. In verse 1, it says, then the whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. If only we had died in Egypt or even here in the wilderness, they complained. Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? Then they plotted amongst themselves. Let's choose a new leader and go back to Egypt. Really? You want to go back to slavery? Are you forgetting? Evidently, they must have forgotten. So Caleb and Joshua spoke. Let's jump down to verse 7. They said to all the people of Israel, the land we traveled through and explored is a wonderful land. And if the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us safely into that land and give it to us. It is a rich land flowing with milk and honey. Do not rebel against the Lord and don't be afraid of the people of the land. They are only helpless prey to us. They have no protection, but the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. Well, the people didn't listen. They wanted to stone Caleb and Joshua. The Lord was angry with them, of course, and he wanted to destroy them. But Moses intercedes yet again. Verse 20. Then the Lord said, I will pardon them as you have requested. But as surely as I live, and as surely as the earth is filled with the Lord's glory, not one of these people will ever enter that land. They have all seen my glorious presence and the miraculous signs I performed, both in Egypt and in the wilderness. But again and again, they have tested me by refusing to listen to my voice. And in verse 28, it says, now tell them this, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very things I heard you say. You will all drop dead in this wilderness because you complained against me. Every one of you who is 20 years old or older and was included in the registration will die. You will not occupy the land I swore to give you. The only exceptions will be Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. They said it themselves. They're going to get their wish. They're going to die in the wilderness, just like they said, it'd be better for us to die in the wilderness. Well, there you go. Verse 34, because your men explored the land for 40 days, you must wander in the wilderness for 40 years, a year for each day, suffering the consequence of your sins. Then you will discover what it's like to have me for an enemy. I say one thing, I don't ever want to discover what it's like to have God as an enemy. So the 10 spies that had given the bad report were struck dead with a plague. And because of unbelief, the people wandered until that whole generation died off. And if you'll notice, even Caleb and Joshua, who were faithful to God, wandered. And even Moses, who was faithful to God, wandered. They all did. But the people chose not to enter. Their children would have the privilege of going in. So God tells them, instead of to keep going to the promised land, you're going to turn around and go back towards into the wilderness in the direction of the Red Sea. Chapter 16, let's flip over to that. So they're wandering, and these are things now that take place while they're wandering. Chapter 16 talks about Korah, who is a Levite. He's a descendant of Kohath. So he's in charge of the sacred items of the tabernacle. And he conspired with Dathan and Abiram. And together they led a rebellion against Moses with 250 prominent leaders or elders. And if you read 16:3, it says, they united against Moses and Aaron and said, you have gone too far. The whole community of Israel has been set apart by the Lord, and he is with us too. What right do you have to act as though you are greater than the rest of the Lord's people? That's what they said to Moses. You've gone too far. What makes you think you're so much greater than we are? We are God's special people too. Moses told them to light their incense burners, and the next morning to burn that incense before the Lord, and then they will see whom the Lord chooses. So Aaron also lights his burner, and they all go to show up. Moses told the Kohathites, you already have a very special role with God. You were chosen by God, set apart, and you even handle the sacred objects. They serve him. They'll be near him. Is that not good enough? Now they're demanding the priesthood as well. So God chose, he did. The next day, he did not choose Kohath, Dathan, and Abiram. So unfortunately, if you read that story, the ground opens up and swallows them along with their household, everything they own, and anyone who was around them that followed them. So, and not only opened up, but it closed over top of them. And those 250 leaders, they were burned up by the Lord. And they left behind their incense burners. So Aaron collected those, and he used the bronze from the incense burners and overlaid the altar. And that was to remind the people not to rebel, and that they were not God's chosen ones, but Moses was. Chapter 17 is another type of chapter where God is proving who he chooses. It's the budding of Aaron's staff. So to end the people's complaining against Moses and Aaron, because they obviously are complaining, what makes you so special? Why do you think God chose you? He says, I want each tribe to bring one staff with their name on it and place it in front of the Ark of the Covenant, which is in the tabernacle. And the one that buds, and it's just a stick, it's not attached to anything. The one that buds is the man that God chooses. Well, Aaron's from the tribe of Levi, sprouted, budded, blossomed, and produced ripe almonds. That is God. It's not connected to anything. So that staff was permanently placed in front of the Ark of the Covenant, and it's as a warning to all rebels. Okay, let's jump over to chapter 20. The people, they're in the wilderness of Zin, and they complained again, they had no water. So in verse 7, it says, and the Lord said to Moses, you and Aaron must take the staff and assemble the entire community as the people watch. Speak to the rock over there, and it will pour out its water. You will provide enough water for the rock to satisfy the whole community and their livestock. Okay, so gather people, speak to rock, water pours out. Got it. Pretty simple. Verse 9. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord, just as he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock. And he said to them, listen now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted up his hand and he struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and their beasts drank. But if you notice, Moses did a few things wrong. He said, we will bring forth water out of this rock, saying that he was part of that. He put himself in the same category as God. That's a big no-no. And Moses struck the rock twice when God told him to speak to it. God was not pleased. In verse 12, but the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you have not believed me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. Wow. So Moses is now not allowed to enter, and Aaron too, into the promised land. Harsh. With all that Moses has done and put up with, and how many times he interceded for these people, it proves how serious sin is to God. God forgives Moses, but he must pay the consequence of his sin. So the people are heading towards the border now of the promised land. And they asked the king of Edom to pass through their land. They won't touch anything. They won't drink from their wells. We just want to pass through. King says, no way, Jose. And he mobilizes his army. So they had to go around Edom. And that'll come back later. Interesting story in chapter 21 of a bronze snake. The people grumbled again against Moses and Aaron, and God sent venomous snakes into the camp and were biting people, and they were dying. So the people repented, help us, help us. Moses prays yet again. And God said, make a replica of a venomous snake and put it on a pole at the top. And if it's bitten, if someone's bit by a venomous snake, they're to look up to the snake that's on the pole and they will be saved. They will be healed. And the snake on a pole, it's symbolic of Jesus, of our Messiah, who, if we look to him on the cross, if we look to him, we too will be saved from the sickness and the venom of sin. Chapter 22 through 24 is about Balaam. Now the people now are camped on the plains of Moab. Like I said, it's right on the Jordan River. Right on the other side is Jericho. They're right on the border of the promised land. And the king of Moab, the one that would not let them go through his land, Balak, he's afraid of all these people. I mean, there's 2.5 million of them. And he keeps hearing stories about some of the victories that they've had. So he hires a sorcerer. His name is Balaam. And he wants Balaam to curse Israel. Now, Balaam is an interesting character. He believes in the power of God, of this Israeli God. He works with any God that you tell him to work with. So he's working with the Israeli God, and he believes in his power, but he's more concerned with the money that he can make than following Yahweh, the one true God. So Balaam tells Balak that I can only say what God tells him to say, because that's what God said to him. So Balak takes Balaam to the high places of Baal. They're overlooking the Israelis. They are down there in their camp, like that picture we saw. We wonder if that's what Balaam saw when he looked down at them, like a shape of a cross. Of course, they wouldn't know what a cross was. But 3 times and in 3 different locations, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Balaam and he put the words in his mouth. And 3 times, Balaam blessed Israel instead of cursed them. Well, this made Balak about nuts. You know, I brought you here and I'm paying you all this money. You need to curse them. Stop blessing them. And he said, look, I told you, I can only say what he tells me to say. If you remember back in Genesis in verse 12, in verse 2, chapter 12, verse 2, I will make you a great nation, God said to them, to Abraham. And he said, I will bless you. Well, he's blessing them. What God says will happen, happens. In chapter 24, verse 17, Balaam is speaking, and he talks about a star will rise from Jacob, a scepter will emerge from Israel. And this is the reference to the coming Messiah. Even Balaam gave reference to Jesus. Very cool. Now it seems that, because God is speaking to Balaam and through Balaam, that he might be kind of a, righteous guy, a good guy. But 2 Peter in chapter 2, verse 15 and 16, it says that Balaam has gone astray, forsaking the right way, that he loved the wages of unrighteousness. So Balaam was not such a good guy after all. But still, God used him. And I already said this, but remember this picture? Maybe that's Balaam and Balak right there, although it looks like a child. But they're looking down and he's going, curse him, curse him. And he blessed him instead. But what an awesome sight that must have been to look down there at that. Okay, chapter 26, we have the second census. The first census was 603,550, and the second one was 601,750. 730, so they're down about 2,000 warriors. It was taken by Moses and Eleazar instead of Moses and Aaron. Aaron had died, and Eleazar is now high priest in Aaron's place. Still the same thing, 20 years old or older, able to go to war, record their names. The Levites are not included. Again, they will not get land. So verses 25 through 26 says that not one person in the first census was on the second census, except Caleb and Joshua. They had all died in the wilderness, just as God said. So Moses is now nearing death, and he will not enter into the promised land that God chose. And Joshua is chosen as the new leader. Chapter 32 talks about the Transjordan tribes. What is that, you say? Two of the tribes, Reuben and Gad, said, we love this land over here. It's fertile for our livestock. We want our land, our inheritance over here, not in the promised land. So we promise to go into the promised land and help you to conquer it, and then we'll come back over here. And Moses agrees. So he gives Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh land on the east side, outside of the promised land. Chapter 33, if you jump down to verse 50, God gives instructions for possessing the land. Now they are to drive out the inhabitants of the land, destroy their figured stones, destroy their molten images, demolish their high places, and they'll inherit the land by lot. So the bigger families will get more land, and the little families will get less land. And if we read still in chapter 33, verse 55, but if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall become about that those whom you let remain of them will become as pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they will trouble you in the land in which you live. And as I plan to do to them, so I will do to you. Well, spoiler alert, they do not drive out all of the inhabitants of the land, which eventually leads to their demise. But we'll talk about that in coming weeks, and let's watch the video.
The Book of Numbers. This fourth book of the Bible carries forward the story of Israel after their exodus from slavery in Egypt. God had brought them to Mount Sinai, and he entered into a covenant with them there. And despite Israel's rebellion, God had graciously provided a way for Israel to live near his holy presence in the tabernacle. So the book of Numbers begins as Israel wraps up their 1-year stay at Mount Sinai, and they head out into the wilderness on their way to the land that God promised Abraham. Now, the book's storyline is designed according to the stages of their journey. So the first section begins at Mount Sinai, but then they set out and travel to the wilderness of Paran. And then from there, they travel to the plains of Moab, which is right across from the Promised Land. Now, the first part opens with a census where the people are numbered. That's where the book gets its name. And then there are laws about how the tribes of Israel were to be arranged in their camp. So the tabernacle was to be at the center, and then around that, the priests and the Levites, and then around them, the 12 tribes neatly arranged with Judah at their head. Now, this was all an elaborate symbol about how God's holy presence was at the center of their existence as a people. This is all followed by a whole series of laws that develop the purity laws from the book of Leviticus. If God's presence was going to be in their midst, every effort should be made to make the camp pure, a place that welcomes God's holiness. In chapter 10, the cloud of God's presence lifts from the tabernacle and guides Israel away from Sinai out into the wilderness, and immediately things go terribly wrong. So in chapter 11, the people start complaining about their hunger and thirst and how they want to go back to Egypt. And then in chapter 12, Moses' own brother and sister begin opposing and bad-mouthing him in front of all of the people. This trip is not off to a good start. The next section begins as the Israelites arrive in the desert of Paran, about halfway to the Promised Land. And God tells Moses to send out the 12 spies, one for each tribe, so they can scout out the Promised Land. So when the spies all return, 10 of them say that there is no chance Israel can survive there because the Canaanites will destroy them. But there are 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, who say that God can save them. But the 10 whip up the people into a fearful rage, and they start planning a mutiny. They're going to appoint a new leader and head back to Egypt. So God is understandably angry, and Moses intercedes on the people's behalf. He calls God to be faithful to his promises to Abraham. And so God does, but not at the expense of his justice. He gives these Israelites what they want, to not enter the land. And God sentences this generation to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they die. Only their children will get to enter the promised land. Now, you'd think this severe consequence would wake them up, but it gets even worse. So in the next story, there's a whole group of Levites that begin a rebellion, and they challenge Moses and Aaron's leadership, saying that they have gone way too far. So God deals severely with these Levites, and he renews his commitment to Moses and Aaron as Israel's leaders. Now, as they leave the region of Paran and hit the road, it goes downhill yet again. The Israelites start complaining again about their thirst, and they ask why Moses even brought them out of Egypt in the first place. So God tells Moses to speak to a rock to bring out water for all of the people. But Moses doesn't really do this. He oversteps his bounds. He hits the rock twice and then says, "You rebels, do we have to bring water out of this rock?" So Moses dishonors God by putting himself in God's place as the one who brings out the water. And so Moses brings down on himself the same fate as the wilderness generation. He too will die in the desert and never get to enter the promised land. After this, the Israelites rebel yet again, and God brings a very strange judgment on them, venomous snakes to come and bite the people. And so Moses again intercedes on behalf of the people. And God tells Moses to do this, to make a bronze snake and to lift it up on a pole, so that whoever looks at this snake would be healed of the poisonous snake bite. It's a very strange symbol, but it speaks to the challenge that God has by being faithful to his covenant. He's right to bring justice on the Israelites' evil and sin. But even God's justice gets transformed into a source of life for those who will look to God for healing. From here, the people head into the plains of Moab, and the first main part of the section focuses on the strange figure of Balaam. So the king of Moab is freaked out at this huge group of people traveling through his territory. So he hires a pagan sorcerer, Balaam, to pronounce curses on Israel. And 3 different times, Balaam finds that he cannot curse them. He can utter only blessing upon Israel. Remember God's promise to Abraham from Genesis 12. So not only can Balaam not curse Israel, but God actually gives him a vision about a future Israelite king who will one day bring God's justice to all of the nations. This vision recalls Jacob's promise to Judah in Genesis chapter 49. Now, it's worth stopping to reflect on the flow of the book so far. The rebellion stories in the wilderness, they just heap up on one another, getting worse and worse. And while God does bring partial acts of judgment on Israel, he's also kept showing mercy, providing food and water along the way. And so the Balaam story, it shows God's grace in bright colors. Because here's Israel. They're down in the camp grumbling and rebelling, but up in the hills, unbeknownst to them, God is protecting and even blessing them. And it's this contrast between Israel's rebellion and God's faithfulness in the wilderness that's what made these stories so important for later generations of Israel. So the wilderness stories are retold time and again by later biblical prophets and poets, and even by the apostles in the New Testament. And these stories always serve as a warning that while God will remain faithful to his covenant promises, he will also allow his people to walk away in rebellion and face the consequences. After this, the rest of the book focuses on the children of the wilderness generation, and they begin preparing to inherit the promised land. They take another census of the new generation, then they go on and win a number of battles with the people groups around them, and then a few tribes even begin to settle in the promised land. So the book ends with the new generation poised to enter into the land, and Moses is about to deliver his final words of wisdom and warning. But for now, that's what the book of Numbers is all about.
Okay, got all that? That's what we've been talking about pretty much. There's a few lessons from Numbers I'd like to go over, and then we'll be done. We said earlier that belief brings rest. So when the people were faithful and walking with God and obedient to him, they had rest and blessings, which was the first 10 chapters and the last very end of the chapters with the next generation. But the opposite is true. Unbelief brings unrest. When they complained, when they rebelled, God disciplined them, and God will discipline us. God disciplines those he loves. And God's way was perfect the first time, but they didn't go with that, but he gave them a second chance. Same is true with us. We can reject his perfect way, but he's merciful and forgiving, and he will always offer a second way or a third way or a fourth way, depending on how stubborn we really are. But his grace is amazing. But unfortunately, when we go other ways than the perfect way, we may have burdens to carry, or we might miss out on God's best. So it is costly when we reject his perfect way. Now, the spies had a bad report. The Israelites were God's chosen people. They were on a mission of faith, not fear. The work was done. The towns were fortified, ready to go, and the fields were plowed and ready to be planted. And all they had to do was drive the people out and occupy the land. They didn't even have to build anything. It was already built. But faith is contagious, and so is lack of faith. They followed the 10. Those 10 did not believe that God was bigger than the giants that lived in the land. So who do we listen to when we face our giants? Because we will, and we do. We've got giants from without, opposition. We've got giants from within, our own fear or anxieties that we struggle with. So like the Israelites, unbelief brings unrest. And then we wander like they wander. And we feel defeated and discouraged. And we spin our wheels, we don't get anywhere. So let's be like Caleb and Joshua and look to God's strength and believe in his strength, not mine. Okay, the bronze snake. 7 times in the book of Numbers, the Israelites were disciplined because of their complaining, because of their rebellion. They had witnessed so many miracles. They saw the parting of the Red Sea. They saw the plagues, how they were separated and they were not affected, but the Egyptians were. It's hard to imagine that they wouldn't believe God. I mean, we're tempted to get a little high and mighty sometimes and go, I can't believe that they wouldn't believe God. I mean, I know I would, but who knows? I do with things now. I mean, they had a little thirst, a little hungry, and they start complaining. They quickly forgot God's promises. So how many times have I forgotten God's promises when I face trials or suffering? It doesn't take much for me to, start complaining. That's for sure. We need to be, again, more like Caleb and Joshua. Balaam, he was on the mountain, blessing them while they're down there grumbling. They had no idea that God was there, causing Balaam to bless them. They didn't even know it. He was working behind the scenes. He was saving them and accomplishing his covenant promise with Abraham. But they didn't know. Same with us. I mean, there are times when we're going through things and God is working, but we may not see it. Whether Israel or us, whether we believe in his promises, he's still going to fulfill his word. Okay. Yes, Numbers is a book about Israel's unbelief, which brought about God's discipline. Even when the people were not faithful, God was still faithful. He still guided them. He didn't leave them. He still provided for their needs, their water, their food. He kept his covenant promise. He continued to develop them knowing what they could be. He does the same for us. He guides us. John 14:6 says, Christ said, I am the way, We know the rest. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Follow him. He's the way. John 8:12 says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. He guides us. He also gives us what he needs. He gives us his word. He gives us his Holy Spirit. He gives us Jesus himself, who is the author and perfecter of our faith. So God is continuing to develop in us what he wants us to be and what he knows we can be, just like he did with the Israelites. So let's trust him and be open to what he has for us. And that is our lesson. And let's end in prayer. Heavenly Father, God, thank you so much for each and every woman here and for this time that we have set apart, set aside to learn about you. Thank you for your holy word where you reveal yourself. And God, you are holy. We can't take that lightly. And you are just. You will punish sin. It is serious business. God, but you are so faithful. You are so loving and forgiving. You are wanting us to come back to you. So God, thank you that you welcome us back into your presence, even when we mess up. So Father, I just pray that you'll be with us this week as we carve out time to work on our homework. It's just spending time with you. I call it homework, but really it's spending time with you. Help us to spend time in your word and reveal yourself to us in a personal way. I thank you and praise you in the name of Jesus. Amen. That's it. We're done. Isn't Numbers great?